Okay, I know this is long, but remember this is 2 weeks worth. Okay, so last time we talked about subsidence and how if we pump out too much groundwater, the ground itself could actually drop. Well, if we actually, in areas where we're near coasts, like the ocean here near our neck of the woods, if we suck out too much water, salt water is going to go actually into the aquifer instead of fresh water. Okay, so this is called what we call saltwater intrusion. So up here is the surface here, what we call the pressure surface, and we start sucking out too much water, then the fresh water, who's being pushed the salt water back, is going to be less and less, and so salt water is going to start going into the aquifer. And that is happening in our neck of the woods. We're using so much water in some regions of the state that seawater is slowly going inwards over time. So if it does it too much, salt water is going to then get into their wells, and now they're no longer sucking out fresh water. They're now going to be sucking out salt water, which is not very good for your crops, right? It's going to kill your crops, actually. So there's ways to get around that. Sometimes what they do is they'll inject water in. They'll drill another well and inject water in. By doing that, it forms a pressure gradient that forms a barrier where the water stays back. So these guys can still pump water, still pump more and more water, but by pumping some back in, you're actually keeping the water back. Well, that's just a temporary fix, and it's very localized when you do that. So it's actually it's more the best thing to do is just limit the amount of water that you're pumping out. By doing so, for example, some areas in the coastal plain has had to actually constrain the amount of pumping that goes out. So if they told people that they can't pump very much water, or only can pump a certain amount, so that they don't actually cause salt water to intrude into our aquifers, okay, and therefore destroy the aquifer. So can be a big problem in our neck of the woods. Now, another problem that we can have is with contamination. Now, if you have contamination on surface water, it's actually something that you can fix fairly, well, not very easily, but okay. Okay, you can actually get that water, suck that water out, clean it, put it back in, and just kind of keep doing that until you dilute it so much that it's really not there anymore. Well, if it gets in the soil, you can't just suck the soil out. Okay, the soil gets saturated with this contamination or something like that, and then it's stuck there for a long, long time. Now, there are ways to fix it, but I'll talk about ways to do that, but it's really hard to do that. Now, one of the biggest sources of contamination in the world is gas stations. Think about it. It's a toxic chemical which is gasoline that can actually get into the groundwater and actually have carcinogens in them that can get and actually cause cancer in you. Well, every single one of you are using it. Every single one of you guys pump it in your own tanks, move it around all over the place. And therefore, they are huge sources of potential leaks. If you guys have any gas that leaks onto the ground, and it can actually get into the soil sometimes. That's why they usually have, gas stations, they're usually sealed with asphalt, but they also, beneath that seal, they even have more seals underneath it so it doesn't get into the ground. But what if it rains and all of a sudden that gas that was on the soil goes off on the edge, and then now you're contaminating the aquifer that way? Or maybe you have an underground water storage tank, which they do, most gas stations do, have underground storage tanks. Well, what if one of them is leaking? Well, that leaking water is going to have the gas and the fuel or whatever go straight into the aquifer and contaminate the aquifer. That could be a potential source. Other things that could be sources of contamination is nitrogen. So have too much nitrogen in it, it can actually cause birth defects in babies, so they can't get enough oxygen into their bodies. It's called the blue baby syndrome. And you can get that from septic tanks or dairies, pig farms, chicken farms. Too much nitrate in the ground is not a good thing. So a lot of the chicken farms around here and the pig farms will get their effluent or their waste and actually spray it out onto their fields for other fields for fertilizer. Well, if you get too much of that effluent out in those fields, you'll have an increase in nitrogen in the groundwater, and it can be problematic. So a lot of what we call, basically, it's the North Carolina Water Resources Department goes around and actually monitors these areas to see if there's any contamination for them. But the problem is they're not funded very well, and therefore they don't get to very many places very much. So there's actually lots of contamination, that could potentially be around our state. One of the #1 sources of contamination in our state probably is agriculture. You also get industry that actually do it, like for example the Kenmore plant where you have Gen X being put in the water and the groundwater up near the Grace Creek area of Mount Fayetteville. So when that happens, if you pump, remember you can pump that contamination into your well, even if you're down. If the contamination is downstream, let's say you had this sewage that was going down to the well, but you are pumping so much that you're now reversing the flow of the water, and now you're sucking up contamination at the same time, right? Or you can have a factory that's upstream and it has a leaky tank, which you are now sucking up into your water and contaminating your water supply, which you can go into the river and contaminate the water supply there as well. There's lots of different sources that you can have. Now, there's ways you can prevent it, kind of mitigate this problem or lessen the effects of it. That's what mitigation means, remember. So the best thing to do is prevent it. Just don't contaminate it in the first place. Okay? And there's lots of laws and regulations in place to make it so that people don't do that. They put seals on them. They try to seal these underground storage tanks the best they can. Put multiple seals on them so that the outside part of it fails, the other part won't, and so forth. There's a lot of safeguards in place that people do. But if it does get contaminated, sometimes we'll have to do what we call pump and treat, where the water goes down here. We might pump wells down into there, pump out the water, treat it, put it back down into the aquifer, and keep doing that. Well, that could be years and years and years for that to take, millions of dollars. Okay, you have what we call selective filtration, which will actually dig down into the ground and put basically a barrier down where the water is filtrating through that material. Very, very expensive, and therefore actually filter the water over time. You can also do what we call bioengineering. You can actually put, for example, there are certain bugs and certain bacteria that like to actually degrade oil. They like to eat oil. And so you put them down a well that has jet fuel contamination or things like that, they'll actually will eat that away and have other byproducts to it. Okay, but by doing that, you're now introducing bacteria into the system that could actually cause problems too. So there's never a really good solution. The best solution is just to prevent it in the first place. Very, very expensive to actually remediate areas with groundwater contamination. One of the most contaminated locations in our nation is actually in our state. It's in Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. It's the Marines base there. Back in the 60s and 70s, there was, and actually all the way through 87, there was a lot of contamination that was going on. They had a lot of contaminated wells. The Marines did not want to tell the Marines about it, people about it, so people were drinking the water. There's highest rates of cancer rates, male breast cancer rates in the nation are from people who actually lived near Jacksonville, specifically at Camp Lejeune. And so these are some of the people exposed to the toxic water all around the world. Now, the Marines didn't actually fess up to this until only about 5-10 years ago. And so some people are actually died from cancer rates because of this, and have also, and just recently, Master Sergeant General Jerry Ensinger, he actually lives down near Elizabethtown, near White Lake. And he actually lost his daughter to a rare disease when she lived there on the base when he was actually stationed there. She lost it, and they figured out it was from this rare disease that was mostly from contamination from the water. And he actually finally got a law passed. President Obama signed it just a couple years ago in place where the people are going to actually, the individuals who were actually impacted by this from 1957 to 1987 are now actually going to get retribution from it. Basically payment from it. I know that's not going to ever get his daughter back or some of the people who've lost their lives because of it, but it's something that they're trying to fix. And there are places like this where we call Superfund sites, places that are contaminated beyond belief all across the nation. And we do have some Superfund sites or some contaminated sites here in Pembroke and pretty much in any town you ever have around the nation. And you can go on the EPA website and actually look those up, and they'll tell you exactly where they are around the nation, the contaminated sites. We have one downtown here. I think, if I remember right, it's near the railroad tracks down here. It's an old site where they would actually store fuel and then put it onto the trucks and then transport it downstream. And so some of that fuel is spilled over time, and there's some problems with contamination around some of those sites. Anyways, so that's one part. Some problems you have with groundwater. You could have using it too much, therefore depleting the land, subsiding the land, or lowering the water levels. You could have contamination. You could have saltwater intrusion. Another thing that can happen is something that we call karst. Well, karst is just caves, or the dissolution of the rock, right? So the water, as it flows through the ground, will slowly dissolve the rock. It can form things called sinkholes. And we can form sinkholes in some parts of our area, but mostly towards Wilmington. Where we're at, we're mostly sand, so we're not going to actually get any sinkholes around here. But once you get closer to Wilmington, where there's some limestone, which dissolves with acidic waters, you can get some sinkholes. But most of these sinkholes are places where you find limestone. So here's the places in the nation where we can find limestone. Places where we find sinkholes in karst topography. Down in Florida is great places. Some places, like I said, near Wilmington and along the eastern United States, you can find sinkholes, but they're not as common. There's some out near Clinton, if you know where Clinton is, and further east of Clinton, there's some out there. There's some really big holes that are underground there. But most of them, they're just not there. North Carolina, especially our neck of the woods, the coastal plain, we just do not get sinkholes because we don't have limestone beneath us. We have sand, and sometimes sand can be eroded away to form little small divots or something like that in the ground, but they're not what we call a karst topography, or a sinkhole caused by natural causes. Okay. However, we talk about this during groundwater, because as water flows through the ground, sometimes they'll form these sinkholes. What will happen is down below, it's slowly dissolving that away to the point where all of a sudden the weight of the ground above no longer can actually hold it up. It falls down into a hole. Well, there's an example of a sinkhole. This is in Guatemala City, and the whole thing fell apart down here. I think it killed 3 people, if I remember right. The whole apartment complex sunk down into the ground. Okay, and if you're lucky, you might find some of these guys around here. I'm just kidding. I love Star Wars, so I had to put this in there because I found this image. But anyways, the point comes is you can find 4 sinkholes, right? Okay, so sinkholes, do they happen near Pembroke? Well, sinkholes do not happen near Pembroke because our underlying sediments consist of mostly quartz sands. We have to have limestone for this. Okay, so the answer here is A here. Happen near Pembroke because our underlying sediments consist of mostly quartz sands. That is not true. Okay, do not happen near Pembroke because our underlying sediments consist of mostly carbonate rocks. So that's not true because remember, carbonate rocks is where they form. Happen near Pembroke because our underlying sediments consist of mostly carbonate rocks, which is also not true. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, that's right. Also, so the right answer here is A. Just for those who don't know. Okay, so here's an example of another sinkhole. This one was actually in Kentucky, near this is with the Corvette Museum. This is the National Corvette Museum. This is actually kind of a funny story, but actually sad at the same time, especially if you like Corvettes. The National Museum is there in Bowling Green, and what happened here is a sinkhole formed right underneath the museum, actually causing some very, very expensive Corvettes. Some of these are over $1 million each to fall down into the hole, and had a lot of damage to them. They did get some of these out, but the sinkhole formed right there in the middle there. If you want to watch the video, this is a video camera. It was the surveillance camera that actually watched the actual cars fall down into the ground because the sinkhole formed. Here's some other sinkholes. These are some fresh sinkholes. Notice that the ground underneath them slowly dissolves away and falls down. Groundwater, pumping of groundwater can cause these. So if you pump too much groundwater, you can actually cause the void underneath. The water is keeping it up, but as you pull the groundwater away, it now has a void there, causing the thing to collapse. So if we pump too much groundwater, we can actually cause sinkholes. But they can also form from leaky pipes, like at this house here, okay, or a leaky swimming pool, like it's a swimming pool that caused this one here, okay, to slowly erode away the banks. A lot of the actual circular lakes in Florida are actually sinkholes. This is actually a sinkhole here. They're old sinkholes that formed in the area. Okay, so that's it. We're done for this area. That was a long section, but remember this is for 2 weeks. Okay, See you guys next time.